Well, hello and good morning, faithful listeners, and welcome to the Bible Explained podcast on this lovely, lovely morning. We're going to be reading an entire chapter of 2 Kings today, talking about possibly Judah's worst king. He might be tied actually with a king we haven't talked about yet, coming up in Judah's history, but this king we're going to read about today is a piece of work and did so much damage to Judah through his idolatry. And he actually was one of the first kings we know of who participated in human sacrifice. So we're going to get into that today. But 7 Weeks Coffee appreciates life in the womb. And that is why they made their coffee brand and named it 7 Weeks Coffee, because the baby, when he or she is 7 weeks old in the mom's womb, is the size of a coffee bean. And so 7 Weeks Coffee, their entire mission is to support pregnancy centers across the U.S. They recently raised $1 million for the pregnancy centers, and they've only been operating for about 3 years now. So good for them for doing such good work. And if you want a great cup of coffee, check out my link in the description. When you purchase coffee using my link, 15% of your purchase will go towards P40 Ministries, and 10% of your purchase will go toward a pregnancy center in the U.S. And the reason I bring up 7 Weeks Coffee today is because we are going to be talking about human sacrifice, particularly involving infants, which is very sickening. So let's read 2 Kings 16. And if you have any kids nearby, this might not be the best episode for them to listen to. Just warning you parents out there. Once again, this is 2 Kings 16 from the WEB. In the 17th year of Pekah the son of Remaliah, Ahaz the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He didn't do that which was right in Yahweh his God's eyes, like David his father, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, and even made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom Yahweh cast out from before the children of Israel. He sacrificed and burned incense in the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. Then Rezin, king of Syria, and Pekah the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, came up to Jerusalem to wage war. They besieged Ahaz, but could not overcome him. At that time, Rezin the king of Syria recovered Elath to Syria, and drove the Jews from Elath. And the Syrians came to Elath and lived there to this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, who rise up against me. Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in Yahweh's house and in the treasuries of the king's house, and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria listened to him, and the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it, and carried its people captive to Kir, and killed Rezin. King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, and saw the altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a drawing of the altar and plans to build it. Uriah the priest built an altar, according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it for the coming of King Ahaz from Damascus. When the king had come from Damascus, the king saw the altar, and the king came near to the altar and offered on it. He burned his burnt offerings and his meal offerings, poured his drink offering, and sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. The bronze altar, which was before Yahweh, he brought from the front of the house, from between his altar and Yahweh's house, and put it on the north side of his altar. King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, saying, On the great altar, burn the morning burnt offering, the evening meal offering, the king's burnt offering, and the meal offering, with the burnt offering of all the people of the land, their meal offering, their drink offerings, and sprinkle on it all the blood of the burnt offering, and all the blood of the sacrifice. But the bronze altar will be for me to inquire by. Uriah the priest did so, according to all that King Ahaz commanded. King Ahaz cut off the panels of the bases, and removed the basin from off of them, took down the sea from off the bronze oxen that were under it, and put it on a pavement of stone. He removed the covered way for the Sabbath that they had built in the house, and the king's outer entrance to Yahweh's house, because of the king of Assyria. Now the rest of the acts of Ahaz which he did, aren't they written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Ahaz slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in David's city, and Hezekiah, his son, reigned in his place. We've seen a lot of bad kings of Judah, but Ahaz kind of takes the cake for the worst Judean king that Judah ever had. It says, in the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, who was the king up in Israel, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the king of Judah, began to reign. Now, Jotham, if you guys remember, we talked about this last week, Jotham was a pretty good king. We don't know of anything particularly bad that he did. Now, he didn't follow in the footsteps of David, which was the king that all the kings should have imitated. But he did do some good things for Yahweh and for the people. But Ahaz was nothing like his father Jotham. Verse 2 says, Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. He didn't do that which was right in Yahweh his God's eyes, like David his father. But he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, and even made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom Yahweh cast out from before the children of Israel. So Ahaz was on a whole different level of idol worship from the other kings of Judah. In fact, this is the first time we see any king, both of Israel and Judah, make their son pass through the fire. And if you guys don't know what that means, it's talking about human sacrifice. And Moloch was the supposed god who demanded infant sacrifice specifically. And this is going to get really grotesque. So if you don't want to hear this, I do recommend skipping over it, especially if there's kids in the room. You probably don't want them to hear this particular part. But what the worship of Moloch looked like was they would make a big, tall, bronze, fat statue of Moloch. And I think it was the head of a bull, if I'm remembering correctly, and the body of a man. They'd make this big bronze statue, and the hands of it would be cupped outward, kind of like as if the statue is trying to like receive something from you. And this was a big statue, big enough that a baby could be placed on the cupped hands of the statue. And in the back of the statue, there'd be this door that you could open, and then they would put a whole bunch of wood in there and light this fire, get this statue so hot that it would start to melt flesh if you touched it. And then to perform the human sacrifice, they would place the little baby on the cupped hands of the statue and play a whole bunch of music, a lot of drums, so that the screams of the infant while he is literally being melted to death would be drowned out by all of the instruments. And this supposedly would quell the anger of this god Moloch when he received this human sacrifice, which typically was the firstborn son. It's appalling and disgusting and sickening. And quite honestly, God was very, very merciful to allow his kings to do something like that without just like killing them dead on the spot. So Ahaz was the first king that we know of, both in Israel and in Judah, who actually sacrificed his firstborn son on the altar to Moloch, which is pretty bad considering the fact that all of the kings of Israel were terrible, absolutely terrible, encouraged all sorts of different type of idolatry, just sort of did whatever they wanted to do. But we don't know of any of the kings of Israel who participated in human sacrifice of infants. We don't know. It could have happened. Scripture doesn't specifically tell us, but Ahaz, this king of Judah, was the first that we know of to actually participate in this. It says he walked in the way of the kings of Israel and even made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom Yahweh cast out from before the children of Israel. So not only did Ahaz walk in the ways of the kings of Israel, who were all evil, but he also really liked all these other forms of worship that the nations around the world were doing. He thought it was innovative and cool. And so he encouraged all sorts of different types of idolatry in Judah. He sacrificed and burned incense in the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. The other kings of Judah so far that you've seen, very few of them actually sacrificed in the high places. They allowed the high places to go on, which also wasn't good because it was a form of idolatry. But this king, King Ahaz, actually actively participated in the sacrificing on the high places. So he was an active participant in the idolatry of Judah. And obviously God is not too happy about this. It says in verse 5, "Then Rezin the king of Syria and Pekah the son of Remaliah king of Israel came up to Jerusalem to wage war. They besieged Ahaz but could not overcome him." And according to Flavius Josephus, the historian, the reason they could not overcome Ahaz at that time was because he was inside Jerusalem, and Jerusalem had such great fortified walls that both the king of Israel and the king of Syria could not actually overcome those walls. So Jerusalem was doing pretty good in spite of this siege. And Rezin, the king of Syria, gets super impatient. So he leaves Jerusalem to go attack Elath, which was another city in Judah, and he was very successful in attacking Elath. In fact, he actually recovered Elath for Syria. Verse 6, "At that time, Rezin the king of Syria recovered Elath to Syria and drove the Jews from Elath, and the Syrians came to Elath and lived there to this day." So now the king of Israel, who happens to be Pekah at this time, is still up against Jerusalem trying to take it, trying to besiege it, even though Rezin left and went back home. So according to Josephus, Ahaz was like, you know what? We're strong enough to take the king of Israel. And Ahaz musters his army in Jerusalem to try to fight against Israel so that Israel will leave them alone. And it does not work. In fact, Israel completely destroys Judah in this battle. And that's talked about in 2 Chronicles 28. Starting in verse 5, this is out of the WEB version. "Therefore Yahweh his God delivered Ahaz into the hand of the king of Syria. They struck him and carried away from him a great multitude of captives and brought them to Damascus." That's talking about the battle with Elath. "Ahaz was also delivered into the hand of the king of Israel, who struck him with a great slaughter." And that's talking about the siege at Jerusalem. And this battle at Jerusalem was particularly bad. Continuing in verse 6, it says, "For Pekah the son of Remaliah killed in Judah 120,000 in one day, all of them valiant men, because they had forsaken Yahweh, the God of their fathers. Zikri, a mighty man of Ephraim, killed Messiah the king's son, Israkam, the ruler of the house, and Elkanah, who is next to the king. The children of Israel carried away captive of their brothers 200,000 women, sons, and daughters, and also took away much plunder from them, and brought the plunder to Samaria." So yeah, Israel had a massive success in this battle. And the reason they had a massive success was because of what it says right here. Because Judah had forsaken Yahweh, the God of their fathers. So it wasn't just because of King Ahaz that God brought this battle to Judah. It was also because of all of the inhabitants of Judah were just fallen away from God. And in fact, there was a very famous prophet who was prophesying during this entire time. And that prophet was Micah. And here's some things that Micah says about Jerusalem in Micah chapter 2. This is from the NLT version. "What sorrow awaits you who lie awake at night, thinking up evil plans. You rise at dawn and hurry to carry them out, simply because you have the power to do so. When you want a piece of land, you find a way to seize it. When you want someone's house, you take it by fraud and by violence. You cheat a man of his property, stealing his family's inheritance. But this is what the Lord says, I will reward your evil with evil. You won't be able to pull your neck out of the noose. You will no longer walk around proudly, for it will be a terrible time." And that's just a little portion of what Micah says about what the Judeans were doing to skew justice and to skew God's law. Elsewhere in the book of Micah, it also says that the Judeans were murderers and were just killing people left and right, oppressing widows and poor people and little orphans and the fatherless. They were taking whatever they wanted from each other. They were accepting bribes in court. They were twisting justice every single chance they got and just living for themselves. They were doing absolutely terrible things. And if you want to read the book of Micah, it's a very fascinating book because Micah wrote all of that during the reign of King Ahaz. So it wasn't just Ahaz doing wrong. It was all of Judah doing wrong. Not to mention, the famous prophet Isaiah was also alive during this time, also prophesying against Israel and Judah, saying, why are you doing such terrible things? God is going to punish you. Stop doing these things. So if you're curious about what Judah and Israel were doing to really tick off God, not to mention the idolatry and the human sacrifice, but everything they were doing, you should read the books of Isaiah, Micah, and Hosea. All three of those prophets were alive and prophesying against Israel and Judah during the reign of King Ahaz. And the reason God brought such a terrible destruction on Jerusalem was because of their skewed sense of justice, their idolatry, their selfishness, their greed, and their oppression of the vulnerable people in Judah. But continuing on with what happens to Ahaz after Judah has such a massive blow done to them actually by Israel, Ahaz decides to appeal to the king of Assyria, who was Tiglath-Pileser, and he was the famous king of Assyria that was known for his expansion of Assyria. And God actually used this to do away with Syria completely. Because when Ahaz appeals to Tiglath-Pileser, Tiglath-Pileser goes into Syria and completely takes it. And that is the end of Syria from these days as we know it. Going back to 2 Kings 16, starting in verse 7, it says, Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, who rise up against me. Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in Yahweh's house and in the treasuries of the king's house and sent it for a present to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria listened to him, and the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it, and carried its people captive to Kir and killed Rezin. And that is the end of Syria as we know it in 2 Kings. Sometimes it's also called Aram, depending on the version of scripture that you read. I believe in the NLT, Syria is referred to Aram the entire time. But yeah, the kingdom of Syria or the kingdom of Aram is now no more. Assyria has finally taken it fully because of King Ahaz. So now that King Ahaz has been helped by Tiglath-Pileser, he decides to go up to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser in person. It says in verse 10, King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and saw the altar that was at Damascus. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a drawing of the altar and plans to build it. So here's the story. So Tiglath-Pileser is now in Damascus. He has just captured it, because that was the capital of Syria at the time. And now that Tiglath-Pileser is in Damascus, so close to Israel and Judah, Ahaz decides to go up to Damascus to visit Tiglath-Pileser for the first time. And while he's in Damascus, the city that has just been completely conquered by Tiglath-Pileser, Ahaz sees this creepy altar that the pagan Syrians would use to sacrifice to their gods, and he likes it. And he's like, oh, wow, that's a really cool looking altar. I've never seen one like that before, not like the altars we have down in Judah, So he sends plans to build the same altar in Judah to the high priest of Judah at the time, who happened to be Uriah the priest. And so Uriah the priest receives these plans to build this brand new false idol altar. And he's like, oh, this looks great. And he builds it. It says Uriah the priest built the altar, according to all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it for the coming of King Ahaz from Damascus. So Uriah hurried to get this done. He's like, let's get this done before Ahaz gets back from Damascus. And so this altar was finished and ready to go for Ahaz to start, worshiping his false gods on this new altar next to his house. And so that is what Ahaz does. It says, when the king came back home from Damascus, he saw the altar, and the king came near to the altar and offered on it. So I don't know if he was like worshiping this altar, kind of seems like it to me, but Ahaz was doing something. And so he's sacrificing on this altar. Ahaz himself is sacrificing on this altar, meaning that Ahaz has just become his own priest. Now, we saw some issues with other kings trying to become priests or high priests before, and God did not look favorably on that at all for reasons that I've previously discussed. But the difference here is that when Ahaz was sacrificing on this altar, becoming his own priest, he was not sacrificing to Yahweh. He was probably sacrificing to Baal or to Moloch or to whatever the Damascus gods were, because that's another thing that 2 Chronicles 28 mentions. Ahaz became a worshiper of the Syrian gods because he's like, the Syrian gods must be very strong, because when Syria came down to attack me, they were successful. And Ahaz started turning towards the Syrian gods. And so obviously when he was up in Damascus, where Syria had just been conquered, he looked around to see what kind of gods they had. And this altar was probably part of whatever gods the Damascus had, which is why Ahaz wanted it down in Judah so that he could start worshiping the Syrian gods, which is so backwards, in thinking, because the Syrians had just been completely defeated. And yet Ahaz was like, their gods must be so much stronger than Yahweh. So it was very backwards thinking. But Ahaz became his own priest, and it says that he sacrificed on this altar and burned his burnt offering on it, his meal offering, poured out his drink offering, and sprinkled the blood of his peace offerings on the altar. Now, what do you guys notice about that? All of those things are related to the worship of Yahweh. The peace offering, the burnt offering, the meal offering, the drink offering, those 4 offerings are what God commanded the Israelites to do for him. So Ahaz is stealing aspects of Yahwism, which is the worship of Yahweh, to incorporate into his worship of idols. And to somebody who didn't fully understand Yahwism, they might have thought that Ahaz was actually worshiping Yahweh when they saw this stuff. Ahaz is pouring out the drink offering and sprinkling the blood and, doing all this stuff that I've seen the other Jews do. So he must be worshiping Yahweh right now. But that's not what Ahaz was doing. He was just stealing from God to worship other idols. And this is something you see happen a lot, even to this day. There are so many forms of worship now that steal aspects of Christianity. For example, I just had Melissa Doherty on the podcast talking about how she had once believed in New Age and New Thought ideology. And something she said on that podcast, which was really interesting, was that New Thought and New Age mix so much Christian principles into the belief system that some people have a hard time seeing that it isn't Christianity. And that was kind of Melissa Doherty's entire testimony, was that she was going to church, like a Christian church that wasn't necessarily New Thought or New Age. But because New Age and New Thought sounded so much like Christianity, she thought that she was actually believing the same things as what her Christian church was teaching. And this is a number one tactic that Satan will use to skew the truth. Because Christianity is the truth. The Bible is the truth. And so Satan is going to use aspects of the truth while promoting a lie. This was the first thing that Satan did, actually, in the Garden of Eden. He told the woman, he said, "You will not surely die." if you touch that fruit, the only thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to become like God, knowing good and evil. And the reason God doesn't want you to eat from that tree is because he doesn't want you to become like him. He wants to hold you back from something. So Satan used a little bit of truth mixed in with a whole lot of lies, because when Eve touched that fruit, she realized, oh, wow, this didn't kill me. So maybe what this little serpent thing is saying is actually the truth. And then sin entered the world after that. But that's what Satan does, is he uses a little tiny bit of truth mixed in with a whole lot of lies. And he really likes stealing from God to make things look a little bit more normal than they actually are. And that right here is what Ahaz was doing. He was taking aspects of Yahwism to worship his own false gods. It says in verse 14, the bronze altar which was before Yahweh, he brought from the front of the house, from between his altar and Yahweh's house, and put it on the north side of his altar. So it seems he didn't like the way the bronze altar looked. In other words, Ahaz was a progressive. He was really interested in what the other cultures of the world were doing. His eye was attracted to that altar in Damascus. There's actually a verse in 2 Kings 20 that says that Ahaz brought a sundial into Judah, which was something that was very new to the world. So Ahaz was a progressive, and it seemed that his taste was kind of gaudy. So he didn't literally, gaudy. So it seems he did not like the altar to God, the bronze altar to God, that was very plain, because God actually told his people, when you make altars to me, make them very plain. In fact, don't even cut the stone that you're using. Just stack stones on top of each other. And the reason was because God didn't want people to start worshiping the creation of the altar. So he told his people, don't make things very beautiful for me. I don't need it. I just want your worship. So the bronze altar to God was not pretty enough for Ahaz, and so he took it away from the temple and put it on the north side behind, it seems, his brand new fancy schmancy Damascus altar. It says, King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, saying, on the great altar, burn the morning burnt offering, the evening meal offering, the king's burnt offering and the meal offering, and with the burnt offering of all the people of the land and their meal offering and their drink offerings, and sprinkle on it all the blood of the burnt offerings and all the blood of the sacrifices, but the bronze altar will be for me to inquire by. So maybe this was to quell Uriah a little bit, because maybe, even though Uriah seems to be a yes man, though he was supposed to be the high priest, perhaps Uriah did have a problem with Ahaz moving the bronze altar in front of God's temple. Maybe Uriah was like, well, that is the altar God commanded us to sacrifice on. But Ahaz possibly manipulates Uriah, saying, oh no, that bronze altar, that's going to be for me only, for the king only. I'm still going to use it. But this, brand new great altar that we just built from Damascus, start sacrificing on that. And then, God's bronze altar, it's not going anywhere. I'm just going to, use it for my personal life. And so Uriah the priest did so according to all that King Ahaz commanded. And that's my best guess. I don't know if Ahaz was trying to manipulate Uriah or not. That's just my best guess. Scripture doesn't specifically say what King Ahaz's motivation was for moving God's altar. But whatever his motivation was not a good motivation. It was something nefarious and evil, most likely trying to discredit Yahwism in Judah. And this wasn't it. Ahaz goes even further, because now that he realizes he can move things around in God's temple without any repercussions, he continues on. It says, King Ahaz cut off the panels of the bases and removed the basin from off of them, and took down the sea from off the bronze oxen that were under it, and put it on a pavement of stone. Now, these were other things that Solomon built for God's temple. The basin and that thing called the sea, those were filled with water so that the priests could wash their hands and their feet before serving God and after doing the sacrifices, just for cleanliness aspects. But Ahaz decides to remove them completely. And eventually, as mentioned in 2 Chronicles 28, Ahaz completely closes down God's temple and doesn't even let any Judeans go there to worship at all. And he erected a whole bunch of altars in every single corner of Jerusalem, is what it says, so that the people could go and sacrifice on these altars and not go worship Yahweh the correct way, which was at his temple. So it starts out small. Ahaz bringing an altar from Damascus. And when Ahaz realizes there's no repercussions, he does more and more and more, to the point where he starts not even allowing the people to worship Yahweh the way God commanded. He also destroyed the gate that his father made, is what it says in verse 18. Do you remember Jotham, Ahaz's father? One of the notable things that he did during his reign as king was he rebuilt the pathway and the gate that led from the king's palace to God's temple, because the king's palace and God's temple were very close to each other. And this pathway was supposed to connect the two, and this gate was supposed to connect the two. And Jotham rebuilt that pathway and that gate so that he could have better access to Yahweh's temple. But then Ahaz completely destroys it. It says in verse 18, Ahaz removed the covered way for the Sabbath that they had built in the house and the king's outer entrance to Yahweh's house because of the king of Assyria. I'm not exactly sure what happened there, but maybe the Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, said you can't have that anymore. I don't know. But Ahaz ends up destroying what his father was known for doing. And to end in verse 19, now the rest of the acts of Ahaz and which he did, aren't they written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Ahaz slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in David's city, and Hezekiah his son reigned in his place. 2 Chronicles 28 mentions that Ahaz was not buried in the tombs of the kings because the people did not like him. So he was buried in Jerusalem. He was buried, I guess with his fathers, but not given the honor of being buried in the tombs of the kings. And the moral of this entire chapter, I think, is two things. It starts out small. One little lie is all it takes for things to start snowballing, for people to stop worshiping God, and for people to start doing things that are worse and worse and worse, to the point where there isn't any worship of God happening anymore. And so we need to be very wary of that, especially when we see little small things happening in our church. We might, brush that stuff off. We might be like, oh, whatever. It's not that big of a deal. It's just one little thing, one little lie that can't really, make much of a difference. But it's crazy how fast that little lie will snowball and become a huge problem for our churches here in America. And the second moral of this story is that you need to be very aware of what kind of things you might be adhering to that could look like Christianity, but actually are not Christianity. There's a lot of books out there that claim to be Christian and kind of feel Christian, right on the surface. But then as you dig a little bit deeper, you can see that they're just stealing principles from Christianity, and it's not really Christianity at all. And that's something to be aware of. Check what you are listening to, what you're reading, what you're involved in with the principles of Scripture. And then you'll know for sure if what you're consuming and believing is really Christianity or not. Well, faithful listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you did, share it on your social media platforms. And speaking of sharing on social media and writing reviews, I haven't read a review in quite a while, so I'd like to do that today. And this kind review is from Jack Moore. And it says, "Thank you, Jen, for reading and discussing in a way for a midlife Bible reader who needs basic understanding. Your voice is clear and calm. You are wonderful. God bless." Well, thank you so much, Jack Moore. I appreciate the kind review of my voice. I actually have had people, though, say that my voice is too calm and too soothing, and so they can't listen to the podcast because it lulls them to sleep. Maybe I could do like one of those nighttime podcasts, like reading through the Bible at night. I'm sure I'd get a lot of people to fall asleep. So I do appreciate you appreciating my voice. Thank you so much for that very, very kind review. And you know what, faithful listener, if you leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Audible or anywhere else that you are listening to this podcast, there's a chance that I will read it here on the podcast, or I will put it up on my website as a testimonial for the podcast. So make sure to leave your reviews. Only if you like the podcast. Don't leave any reviews if you don't like it. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, all podcast reviews, even if they're negative, do help push the podcast to more people. So yeah, you can leave negative reviews if that is what you want to do also, because it actually helps me in the end. All right, faithful listeners, have a fantastic and wonderful rest of your day. Happy listening, and God bless.